It was a grey April afternoon in 2016, the kind of day when the wind blows with that damp chill that seems to penetrate your clothes and stick to your skin. The town of Cedar Hollow, in rural Michigan, was immersed in its slow, predictable rhythm, and the old building on Maple Street, a large house with worn bricks and broken windows, was just another silent reminder of a forgotten past. A group of construction workers had been hired to renovate the place, transforming the abandoned skeleton into a small community center. The job was simple: knock down walls, reinforce the structure, and clean away the traces of time. But no one there imagined that, by touching that building, they were about to open the door to something that should never have been discovered. The clang of tools echoed through the main hall, mixed with the rhythmic sound of hammers and the metallic whine of chainsaws. In the midst of this noisy routine, the youngest mason on the team, Mike, suddenly stopped. He frowned and removed his earplugs. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make one's skin crawl. From somewhere behind the concrete wall came a muffled, faint, almost imperceptible sound. At first it sounded like the distant meow of a trapped cat, but then it repeated itself, a sob, a short human cry. Mike called to the others, who laughed, saying it must be the wind working through cracks. But he persisted. He pressed his ear to the wall, and this time the sound came. Through more clearly, someone was crying. The foreman, Tom Harris, a man accustomed to dealing with strange noises and construction site stories, approached. He knocked on the wall with his closed fist 3 times, as if testing for an echo. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small sound responded, a scratchy, trembling whisper that seemed to come from within the wall. Tom recoiled, his heart racing. He looked at his colleagues, waiting for a reaction, but they all seemed as confused as he was. This made no sense. The building had been abandoned for over a decade, sealed off, without electricity, with no access to the lower floors. And yet, there was someone there. They tried to ignore it, to get back to work, but the crying continued. It came and went like a hidden breath. Some began to get irritated, others became visibly uncomfortable. Tom, however, couldn't take his eyes off that wall. There was something wrong, something deeply wrong about this place, and deep down, he knew. If that sound was real, if someone was really back there wouldn't be much time left. That night, as everyone left, Tom stood in front of the empty building, staring at the dark windows. The echo of that cry still echoed in his head, mixed with a feeling he couldn't explain. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was guilt. The wind blew harder, pushing the door open, which creaked open on its own. And it was there, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, that he had the first of many doubts that would haunt him for months to come. Because if there really was someone behind that wall, who in their right mind would have put that person there? Some people hear a story like this and skip right past it, but those who truly feel it, who thrill with every twist and turn, who get goosebumps trying to imagine what was behind that wall, understand the weight of what's happening here. This channel is for those who can't stand a poorly told mystery, for those who believe that every disappearance story deserves to be heard to the end, with emotion, truth, and that butterflies in the stomach feeling that makes us doubt what's real. Here, each episode is more than a case. It's a dive into the darkest side of the human soul, where fear and hope walk hand in hand. So come be part of this community that doesn't look away when the truth begins to emerge. Press the subscribe, leaves the like, and helps give voice to stories the world has tried to bury. Because there's much more behind these walls than we imagine. Tom Harris wasn't the kind of man who easily believed in strange things. He'd spent much of his life facing what most people run from: fear, fires, accidents, situations where danger had shape, smell, and sound. He was a former firefighter, accustomed to chaos and the fine line between heroism and tragedy. But in recent years, the fire he fought wasn't coming from outside. It was inside. After losing his best friend in a botched operation, he left the rescue force and tried to hide from his past, working on simple construction projects, far from any memories that would bring back that night. When he was called to oversee the renovation of the old Maple Street building, he imagined it would be just another job. But from the first day, something about the place felt heavy. The building was old, damp, with a smell of rotting wood mixed with mildew. It had boarded up windows and walls that seemed to breathe when the wind blew. Tom felt a strange familiarity with that air of abandonment, as if he and the building shared the same sense of silent ruin. Work, for him, was a way to keep his mind occupied, to take his mind off things. But his routine began to change the very moment that cry was heard. Since then, a restlessness grew within him, a mixture of fear and impulse, as if something were calling him. In the days that followed, as the crew continued their work, Tom couldn't stop thinking about that sound. He tried to convince himself it was just the wind blowing through the gaps or some trapped animal, but something was different. The tone of desperation, the irregular cadence, the cry for help, it all seemed too human to be coincidence. He remembered his colleagues' reactions. They laughed, they mocked, they continued their work. But Tom knew well the kind of silence that comes after doubt. It was the same one he felt before entering a burning building, when something inside him told him there was someone inside waiting for help. That night at home, his wife Linda noticed he was different. Tom spoke little, ate dinner in silence, and stared blankly at a random spot on the wall, as if he could still hear the echo of that crying. When she asked what was going on, he simply replied, "I think someone's there." Linda tried to laugh, thinking it was a joke, but his expression was too serious. She leaned closer, placed her hand over his, and told him what he already knew, that the building had been abandoned for over 10 years, that no one lived there, that he was just imagining it. He agreed, but inside a part of him screamed. The next day, Tom arrived at work early, before everyone else. The sun hadn't yet fully risen, and the air was cold enough to make his breath come out in white clouds. He entered the building and stood in the same spot where they'd heard the crying. He stood there, silent, for long minutes, observing every detail. The cracks in the concrete, the pattern of damp patches, the distant echo the wind made as it blew through the cracks. Nothing, not a sound, until suddenly a drop of water fell from the ceiling and hit the floor. A simple, unremarkable sound. But in that moment, his heart raced. He realized he was tense, waiting for something to happen. And worst of all, he wanted to hear that crying again. During the shift, he tried to ignore the feeling that he was being watched. But the more he tried, the stronger it became. And it wasn't just him. The younger construction worker, Mike, commented that he felt strange chills whenever he walked through the back hallway. Another worker, Rick, swore he heard footsteps upstairs, even though everyone knew that floor was condemned and off-limits. Tom began to mentally record everything, almost as if he were returning to his firefighter days, when every detail could mean the difference between life and death. He wanted to understand the pattern. On one of his lunch breaks, Tom grabbed his coffee and walked outside the building, seeking some fresh air. He leaned against a pile of planks and watched the cloudy sky, trying to dispel the memories. But he only had to close his eyes to hear the crying again, the same childish tone, the same muffled plea for help. He opened his eyes suddenly, his heart racing. He knew he wasn't crazy. He'd heard many sounds in his life, but none had caused him as much discomfort as that one. And deep down, he knew why. That sound reminded him of the desperation of those who haven't been saved. From that moment on, something changed in Tom. He began to feel like that place wouldn't leave him alone until he discovered what was behind that wall. He tried to convince others to check it out, but no one wanted to risk it. The company was on a tight deadline, and any delay would mean losing money, so Tom kept the idea stuck in his mind, chewing it over silently. When he drove home, he would look in the car mirrors and imagine the face of the person crying inside. At night, he dreamed of dark hallways and voices whispering his name. And when he woke, it felt like the dream hadn't ended. It just continued, disguised as reality. He began researching the building. He discovered it had been built in the 1950s, served as a shelter during a flood, then as a city document repository, and finally had been abandoned after a mysterious fire in the basement. No official records mentioned any casualties, but rumors circulated among the older residents. Stories of people disappearing nearby, screams heard at night, and lights flickering in the windows even when the building was unoccupied. It all seemed like small-town folklore until Tom came across a strange piece of information. The former owner, Howard Lindsley, had been an eccentric engineer who lived in isolation for decades and disappeared shortly before the building was sealed. Tom didn't tell Linda anything. He just said he was tired, that work was hard. But in truth, he felt something much greater than exhaustion. It was as if fate had pushed that building into his path, as if he'd been chosen to find something no one else would. And even without understanding why, he knew he wouldn't stop until he figured out what that sound meant. That Friday, when everyone had left, Tom stood alone on the construction site, walking among the rubble. The late afternoon light filtered through the cracks in the planks, casting long shadows on the walls. He ran his hand over the cold concrete and felt a slight, almost imperceptible vibration. He took a step back and heard a dull sound, like a soft knock coming from the other side. He froze, his breath catching in his lungs. The knock repeated itself in short intervals, as if someone were knocking, trying to answer. Tom's entire body tensed, his mind searching for a logical explanation. For a few seconds, he thought he was imagining it all, that the sound was coming from the machines or the wind. But then the final blow was accompanied by something different, a short, shaky breath. And for the first time, Tom felt truly afraid, not of what might be inside, but of what he might discover if he continued. Still, he didn't back down. He stood there, his heart pounding loudly, his eyes fixed on the wall as if he could see right through it. The rescue instinct he'd tried to bury for years returned with a vengeance, screaming inside his head. That night, Tom didn't sleep. He lay staring at the ceiling, remembering the sound, the tapping on the wall, the breathing that seemed to respond to every knock. He knew that what was trapped there wasn't just the echo of an old building. It was something alive, something that wanted to be heard. And the more he tried to ignore it, the clearer it became that fate was calling him back to what he'd sworn never to face again. The need to save someone everyone else had forgotten. The next morning, the day seemed like any other in Cedar Hollow. The same grey sky, the same cold wind cutting through the street, the same small-town silence. But for Tom Harris, nothing was the same. He arrived at the construction site earlier than usual, and the building felt different, darker, denser, as if the air inside had gained weight. The echo of his boots on the bare ground was too loud, and each step felt like a defiance of his own instincts, screaming not to return. The place where they had heard the crying was now covered in a stubborn shadow, and for some reason the sound of tools, of colleagues, talking. Everything seemed muffled, distant. He tried to convince himself it was just fatigue, but the truth was, that sound from the night before had not left him alone. That's when something changed again. Mike, the youngest bricklayer, was demolishing a section of the opposite wall when he suddenly stopped. He looked at Tom and said in a low, almost whispering voice, "Do you hear that?" Everyone stopped. For a few seconds, there was absolute silence. And then, there it was again. The same, muffled sound. But this time a little louder, closer, almost impatient. A sob, a ragged breath, something alive. Tom ran to where the sound seemed to be coming from and pressed his ear to the concrete. It wasn't an echo, it wasn't wind, and it wasn't imagination. It was someone really crying on the other side of the wall. The air seemed to drain out of place. Some workers laughed, others turned pale. No one knew what to say. One suggested it might be a trapped animal, another that the building had old pipes that made strange noises. Tom, however, felt his heart race in a different way. He knew that kind of sound, the sound of suppressed agony, of the fear of someone trying to call for help, but lacking the strength to scream. He looked around and realized no one would do anything. So he bent down, picked up the hammer, and gave the wall 3 firm knocks. With each knock, the sound on the other side fell silent, as if the person had stopped to listen. And then came a response, a light tap as if someone knocked back. A short knock, then another. In that instant, time seemed to stand still. Mike took a step back, his face tense, while the others looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Tom, inside, was waging a battle between fear and reason. This couldn't be possible. No one could survive in there for that long. The wall was nearly 18 inches thick, with no openings, no ventilation. And yet, someone was trying to communicate. During lunch, no one talked about it. They feigned normalcy, as if ignoring it was the best way to protect themselves from what they didn't understand. But Tom couldn't swallow his food. His head was spinning in 1,000 directions. Who was there? Why? And how? Sometimes he felt the urge to simply break everything and find out, but prudence held him back. If he was wrong, it could cause a serious accident. Still, the feeling that something terrible was hidden behind that wall grew like a constant pressure. At the end of the day, when the last truck had left, Tom was left alone in the building. The sun was setting slowly and shadows were slowly swallowing the ground. He walked to the exact spot where the sound was coming from and placed his hand on the cool concrete. He closed his eyes. There was no sound, only the distant rumble of a car passing by on the street. He stood there for a few minutes in absolute silence until he heard, faintly, almost imperceptibly, a whisper. Not a cry, a whisper. Something he couldn't quite make out, but it sounded like a word repeated with difficulty. Tom pulled his hand away and took a deep breath. It was no longer a random sound. It was a voice. He tried recording with his cell phone, but the microphone picked up only noise. The wall seemed to absorb the sound, as if hiding not only its source but also the truth itself. He considered calling the police, but fear of being discredited held him back. He could already imagine the officers' laughter, the disdainful looks, the cold. Reports stating no evidence of human activity. What if all this made him seem insane? No. He needed proof, something concrete. As he turned off the lights and locked the gate, a memory came rushing back to him. The look on his face of the colleague he couldn't save years ago, trapped in the flames, reaching out and saying, "Don't leave me here." The same helplessness that had destroyed him that night seemed to return now, only in the form of a cry coming from behind a wall. He tried to push the thought away, but it was too late. It had already trapped him. That morning, Tom woke up sweating, his heart racing. He dreamed of the building, of corridors stretching endlessly, and of a wall that pulsed as if breathing. He woke with the feeling of being watched. The clock read 3:22 a.m. The silence was total, but he was sure he heard a distant sound, a faint heartbeat, almost like an answer. He stood up, looked out the window, and the wind swayed the trees as if the outside world were trying to warn him of something. He didn't know what was happening, but he was absolutely certain of one thing. That sound wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning, and somewhere inside that building, someone was waiting for him. In the days that followed, Tom Harris tried to return to his work routine, pretending nothing strange had happened. But it was impossible. The sound of that voice, that muffled cry, echoed in his mind like a constant buzzing. He would wake in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, with the feeling of being called by someone he couldn't see, and the more he tried to push it away, the stronger the feeling became, a mixture of guilt, fear, and curiosity. The building, which had previously seemed merely a decaying place, now watched him. Every noise, every creak of the ancient beams, every shadow cast by the evening light seemed to contain a hidden message, a cry for help from the past. It was on one of these silent mornings that Tom began to notice a pattern. While supervising the crew, he noticed that the sound didn't occur at any time of day. It always occurred in the late afternoon, around 5, when the sun was beginning to set and golden light filtered through the cracks in the broken windows. He began to pay attention to his surroundings, mentally recording the times, the exact spot on the wall, the direction of the echo. The voice, or whatever it was, seemed more intense when the building was empty, as if waiting for loneliness to manifest itself. It was a behavior, a pattern of behavior. Tom knew what he was doing. It was the same instinct that had guided him during the fires, when he needed to see beyond the smoke, beyond the chaos. Every noise, every detail, every clue formed a bigger picture, and he felt he was about to connect something no one else noticed. He began discreetly researching the building. He discovered it had been built in 1954 as a branch of a former government shelter during the Cold War. Later, it became the private property of a civil engineer named Howard Lindsley. The name appeared in tax records and in an old newspaper article from 1971, which referred to the building as a unique work of underground structure and safety. After that, Lindsley's name disappeared from public records. Tom became obsessed. He spent his nights combing through forums, city records, and old news articles about Cedar Hollow. He discovered that between 1998 and 2003, 10 people had disappeared in the area. Men and women of different ages, all with one thing in common: they lived or worked near the same block. None of the cases had been solved. Police attributed the disappearances to voluntary migrations or isolated accidents, but for Tom it couldn't be a coincidence. One night he was sitting at his computer reading a missing persons report when he came across a detail that made him stop. One of the victims, a nurse named Sarah Green, had last been seen entering an abandoned building on Maple Street, the same building he was working in now, and what stood out most was the date, April 2003. Exactly 13 years to the day he heard the first cry. 13 years. The number repeated itself on several dates related to mysterious cases in Cedar Hollow. 13 years between each disappearance reported in that area. From then on, what had previously seemed merely a curiosity became a necessity. Tom began carrying a notebook with him, recording every sound, every sensation, every coincidence, and the more he wrote, the more he realized the building told a story. The cracks, the marks in the concrete, the areas where sounds echoed differently. Everything seemed to draw a hidden map, as if someone had deliberately left clues. He even began to believe that Howard Lindsley had built the building to hide something, or someone. At the construction site, the workers noticed the change. Tom was quieter, more focused, almost paranoid. He stared at the wall for long minutes, as if waiting for it to breathe. One of the men, trying to break the tension, joked, "Are you waiting for her to talk again, boss?" Tom didn't respond. He just looked at him and said softly, "She didn't stop talking. We're the ones who stopped listening." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. No one understood what he meant, but no one wanted to ask. At night, he would return to the building alone, claiming he needed to review the progress of the work. But in reality, he entered silently, walking the dark corridors, listening. There was something about the way the sound moved, the way the air changed temperature in certain spots. He began to notice that, near the wall where the crying was coming from, the cold was different, biting, dry, almost metallic. He would touch the concrete and feel a slight, constant vibration, as if something were pulsing inside. One of those nights, he brought an old tape recorder. He turned it on and let it play for almost an hour. When he returned home and listened to the audio, his blood ran cold. Amidst the ambient noise, there was a sequence of noises that, isolated, formed a sort of pattern. 3 beats, a pause, 2 short beats, repeated almost rhythmically, like a code. Tom showed the audio to a friend, a former firefighter colleague, who was fascinated by Morse code communications. After a few minutes of listening, the man looked up and asked, "Are you sure this is natural? Because what I understand here is a..." "Short word, help." Tom fell silent, staring at the recorder. Try as he might to find a logical explanation, he couldn't. Someone or something was crying out for help, and the more he investigated, the more the building stopped being just concrete. It seemed like a living body full of buried memories, breathing through cracks, weeping through the walls. The next day he arrived at the construction site determined to confront the police. He brought the audio and records of the disappearances, but deep down something inside him knew that wouldn't be enough. No one would believe him. No one wanted to believe him. And as he left the building, he took one last look at the wall. The afternoon light filtered through the cracks, creating irregular patterns on the concrete. For a brief moment he swore he saw a shadow move inside, slowly, silently, as if someone were touching the other side. Tom blinked, and the shadow vanished. But the shiver that ran through him made it clear something had changed. From that moment on, he wasn't just watching the mystery. The mystery was watching him, too. That morning, Tom summoned the courage to go to the Cedar Hollow police station. He carried the recorder in his jacket and an envelope containing the notes and newspaper clippings he'd collected over the past few days. He'd been awake all night, trying to organize his thoughts and piece together a logical line, something that could convince any rational person that what was happening in the Maple Street building wasn't just superstition or delusion. Sergeant Mark Dugan, a portly man with a tired expression and a suspicious look, waited impatiently. Tom explained everything: the sounds, the crying, the Morse code, the past disappearances. He spoke clearly, trying to maintain a calm tone, even with his heart racing. When he finished, Dugan was silent for a few seconds, drumming his fingers on the table, and then he let out a heavy sigh, as if he already knew what he was going to say. "Harris, look," he began, shifting in his chair. "This building has been investigated before. There's a record of it. In 2005, after a complaint similar to yours, we sent a team, sniffer dogs, heat sensors, everything. Nothing was found. No bodies, no shelter, nothing. It's just a pile of old concrete." Tom insisted, opening the envelope, showing the clipping of the missing nurse, mentioning Lindsley's name, the successive disappearances, and the audio recording of the knocking. But the sergeant just shook his head, with that smile that mixed pity and disdain. He said strange sounds in old buildings were common, that ancient structures created resonances, echoing noises from distant streets. And when Tom tried to show the audio, Dugan held up his hand, cutting him off. "I understand your good intentions," he said condescendingly, "but you're seeing things where they aren't. I've seen this before. Tired people, ex-military, ex-firefighters, the brain plays tricks. That sentence hit Tom like a punch. What the officer didn't know was that he'd spent years trying to prove just the opposite, that he could still trust his own mind, that the trauma hadn't broken him. He left the police station with his face hot and his entire body shaking. For the first time, it wasn't just frustration, it was anger. Anger at seeing the same indifference, the same disregard he'd seen so many times in real disappearance cases, when the police decide there's not enough evidence and turn the page. As he drove back, the recorder on the seat next to him seemed to pulse like a reminder. He knew what he'd heard, and he knew that if he waited for the authorities, the sound behind the wall, that cry for help, would be ignored until it disappeared completely. During the drive, his head spun. He tried to understand why the sergeant seemed so certain the building had already been searched, and why there were no public records of it. Something was wrong. Someone was hiding something. That night, Tom skipped dinner. He sat on the couch, staring at the floor, replaying his conversation with Dugan on a loop. Linda tried to convince him to drop the subject, telling him he was wasting his time. He simply replied, "You didn't hear me, Linda. I heard you. Someone's there." She persisted, concerned about her husband's growing obsession, but Tom no longer listened. Inside, an ancient instinct was beginning to stir, the same one that had made him run into burning buildings when everyone said there was no one inside. The next morning, Tom returned to work as if nothing had happened, but inside something had changed. He no longer believed anyone would come to his aid, and strangely, that relieved him, because from that moment on, he no longer depended on anyone. While the other workers concentrated on the renovation, he discreetly marked points on the wall, measured distances, and observed the airflow. He discovered small cracks hidden beneath layers of plaster and realized that the concrete in that section was thicker than the rest of the building. This wasn't a construction error. It was intentional. When the shift ended, Tom waited for everyone to leave. He stood alone in the building, facing the wall again. The sun had already set and the air was heavy. He pressed his ear to the concrete and for a moment thought he wouldn't hear anything. But then came the sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A cry, the same voice. Only now something was different. Between the sobs he could make out one word, a single scratchy syllable, almost unrecognizable, but it chilled his blood. Help. Tom took a step back, his breath quickening. The sound stopped, and in the silence that followed, a crack echoed inside the wall, as if something had moved within. He stood still, his heart hammering in his chest, feeling as if he had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer just curiosity. Now it was personal. That same night, Tom wrote down everything he'd heard, every detail, every sensation, and as he wrote, he noticed something he hadn't noticed before. The crying always started at 5, but ended exactly at 5:58. Exactly 60 minutes, every day. It was like a ritual, and that could only mean one thing. The sound came from someone or something still trapped inside, and if the police wouldn't do anything, he would. But before he could act, something even stranger happened the next morning. When he arrived at the construction site, he found a city car parked in front of the building. 2 men in suits were watching the scene and talking in low voices. When he asked who they were, they said only that they were there to assess structural issues. One of them stared at Tom for a second too long before smiling and saying, "It's best not to mess with where you shouldn't, Mr. Harris. Old buildings hide more than dust." Tom stood there, watching them get into the car and disappear around the corner. His blood ran cold. Because in that moment, he understood the problem was much bigger than a wall and a mysterious sound. There was something, or someone, who wanted to keep that secret buried, and he was in too deep to turn back. That night, Tom Harris made a decision that would change everything. After weeks of hearing the same sound, facing the authorities' disregard and the suspicious gaze of everyone around him, he realized there was no point in waiting any longer. The building was calling to him, silently and insistently, and ignoring it was like trying to silence a scream already living inside him. From that moment on, he would no longer be the man seeking explanations. He would be the man seeking answers, no matter the cost. He waited for Linda to fall asleep, grabbed the flashlight, hammer, and the same tape recorder he'd used earlier. He left the house slowly, without turning on the lights, and drove to the construction site. The clock read 11:47 p.m. when he parked the car. The city was plunged into near silence, and the cold wind cut through his skin like thin blades. As he entered the building, the sound of the gate creaking echoed throughout the empty hall. Tom took a deep breath and caught the familiar scent of mildew and rusted iron, a scent that now seemed a part of him. The flashlight trembled in his hand, its beam sweeping across the dust and debris-covered floor. Each footstep sounded louder than it should have. Each shadow cast by the broken windows seemed to move a little behind him. Tom walked to the back hallway, the same place where the crying had come from, and stopped in front of the wall. He stood still, his ear pressed to the concrete. For a moment, nothing. No sound, no voice. His heart was pounding so hard it seemed to fill the silence, until very faintly he heard something, a soft tap, a single beat, then another, and then a third. It was the same pattern. 3 beats, a pause, 2 short ones. The same code, the same call for help. He shone the flashlight on the wall and observed every crack, every dark spot. He ran his hand over the concrete and felt a subtle difference in the texture, as if a section of the wall had been patched. It was there. Without thinking twice, he picked up the hammer and struck the first blow. The dry sound of the impact echoed throughout the building. He struck the second, the third. With each blow, the concrete shattered into fragments that fell heavily to the floor, raising a fine cloud of dust. In the midst of it all, he heard, now clearly breathing from the other side. Tom froze. He put his ear to it again and heard the sound of someone moving inside, as if dragging something across the floor. Then a voice, faint, hoarse, almost unrecognizable, whispered, "Please." It was enough to keep him going. He knocked harder, ignoring the pain in his arms, ignoring the cold sweat trickling down the back of his neck. The plaster began to give way, revealing a metal layer beneath the concrete, a kind of sheet metal like a sealed door. He took a few steps back, panting, trying to understand. This wasn't a simple structural wall. It was a hidden entrance. For a moment he considered stopping, maybe calling someone, documenting everything before continuing. But the thought of Sergeant Dugan filled him with rage. He knew what would happen if he asked for help. He would be ignored again, and the sound behind the wall would be swallowed by silence once more. No, this time he wouldn't back down. He picked up an iron bar lying on the ground and tried to pry open the sheet. The metal gave just a little, enough for a blast of cold air to escape through the crack. The smell was unbearable, a mixture of damp, rust, and something else, something sweet and sickening, familiar to him from his time as a firefighter, the smell of death. Tom instinctively recoiled, the flashlight trembling in his hand. He took a deep breath and tried to dispel the memory that suddenly came to him, that of his colleague lost in the flames, the same one he couldn't save, the same scream stuck in his mind for so many years. With trembling hands he crouched down, putting his ear close to the crack. The sound was clearer now. It was no longer crying, but murmurs, several. Different voices whispering incoherent words. It was impossible to make out what they were saying, but one of them seemed to repeat the same name, slowly, almost like a lament. Howard. Howard. Tom's heart raced. He knew that name. Howard Lindsley, the building's former owner, the man who had disappeared without a trace. The stories he'd heard about him began to blur together in his head. The reclusive engineer, the man who designed underground shelters, the man who claimed to be protecting people from the outside world, and now there was his name coming from inside the wall. Tom stood, staring at the cracked concrete, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Dread. Not the kind of fear that paralyzes, but the kind of fear that alerts, that warns him that something is terribly wrong. He knew he couldn't go on alone, but he also knew no one would believe him. He glanced at his watch. 1:12 a.m. The entire building seemed alive, breathing along with him. Suddenly, a strange sound echoed from the other side, something like metal scraping against metal, followed by a loud crack. Tom stepped back, gripping the flashlight tightly. The sheet metal seemed to vibrate for a second, and then silence. A thick, suffocating silence, the kind that makes your ears hurt. He stood there still, his chest rising and falling rapidly, waiting for any new signal. But nothing happened, only the distant sound of the wind. For a moment he considered leaving, forgetting everything, pretending none of this was real. But as he turned his back to the wall, he heard a short, isolated sound coming from the metal crack, a single, barely audible word, spoken in a voice that seemed too human to be a figment of his imagination. "Tom." He froze. His blood ran cold. How could anyone inside know his name? The echo of that word pierced him like an invisible blade. He stood there in shock, his heart hammering in his chest, unable to decide if what he had heard was real or just the beginning of a madness that was beginning to take hold of his mind. But deep down, Tom knew someone was there, and now that someone knew exactly who he was. Tom woke with his face pressed against the steering wheel, his body heavy, and his head throbbing. He'd spent the night awake, parked in front of the building, staring at the dark windows. He tried to convince himself he'd imagined it all, the voice, the name, the sound coming from inside the wall, but every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the exact moment he'd heard it. Tom. There was no forgetting the drawl, the tone too human to be coincidence. He knew what he'd heard. The problem was, this time, he also knew what it meant. He was entering dangerous territory, and not just physical. His mind was beginning to be tested. In the following days, work continued on the site, but Tom was no longer the same. He slept little, ate almost nothing, and his colleagues began to notice that he avoided talking. He would spend hours standing still, watching the wall as if waiting for it to move. His gaze had changed, emptier, more distant. Mike, the youngest mason, even commented to the others that the boss had the look of someone who'd seen too much. No one dared ask what was going on, but everyone sensed that the atmosphere was different, heavy. The lights flickered more frequently, tools dropped on their own. The sound of the wind seemed to come from inside the walls, not outside. It was as if the building had awakened. At home, Linda tried to feign normalcy, but her marriage was in ruins. Tom barely spoke, always locked in his office, scribbling notes and floor plans. She would knock on the door, ask if he was okay, and he would only reply with, "I'm working on some things." Sometimes in the middle of the night she would find him sitting in the kitchen, staring into space, as if listening to something only he could hear. The expression on his face frightened her. It wasn't anger nor sadness. It was a mix of obsession and guilt, the look of someone who believes they're being summoned by something the rest of the world refuses to see. Tom began having lapses, moments when he couldn't remember how he got to certain places. Once, he woke up inside the building, covered in dust and with bruised hands, his hammer thrown on the floor. He had no idea how he'd gotten there. The flashlight's display indicated he'd spent nearly 5 hours inside. There were fresh marks on the wall, as if he'd repeatedly hit it hard. And strangest of all, on the cracked surface was a charcoal drawing, an irregular circular shape he didn't remember making. He tried to erase it, but the line seemed too deeply etched. From that day on, something inside him snapped. Conversations with his colleagues became increasingly short, and suspicious looks began to appear. Word began to spread that he was returning to the building at night. Some said he was going crazy, others that the building was cursed. Mike, the only one still showing any concern, tried to talk to him, but Tom reacted angrily. "It's not in my head, Mike. There's someone there. I heard it," he shouted, his eyes red. Mike backed away, frightened, unsure of how to respond. That night, Linda was waiting for him. When he came in, she spoke firmly. "Enough, Tom. You have to stop this. This building is destroying you." He tried to argue, saying he couldn't stop now, that he was close to discovering the truth. She interrupted him, tears in her eyes, and asked, "What if the truth is just another lie you're making up to avoid facing what you lost?" He remained silent, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the question hit him where it hurt most. The loss of his friend, the failure of the past, the guilt he carried like an invisible weight. In the following days, Tom began to avoid sleeping. He was afraid of what he might dream. When he closed his eyes, he saw his colleague's face burned by the fire, mixed with the sound of the voice whispering his name inside the wall. The two things merged until he no longer knew where the past began and what was happening now ended. Exhaustion made him more vulnerable, and the hallucinations began to seem routine. He saw figures passing through the building's corridors, shadows that seemed to watch from afar, waiting for the right moment to approach. But exhausted as he was, there was something that kept him going, the feeling that everything was about to be revealed. It was as if he were faced with a vast secret, about to be unearthed, and he was the only one capable of hearing it. And the more time passed, the more he believed the building was trying to communicate with him. Sometimes, the sound from the wall wasn't just crying. It was as if several voices whispered at once in low tones, creating a dissonant harmony that made his heart race. One night, as he stared at the wall for the 1000th time, he noticed something he hadn't noticed before. The sound wasn't coming from just one spot. There was a kind of vibration that spread throughout the floor, as if there were a hollow space just below, an underground compartment. He grabbed his flashlight and began tapping his foot on the concrete, listening to the echo. In some spots the sound was solid, but right in the center of the hallway there was a patch where the echo was different, hollow, deep. This confirmed what he'd already suspected. The building had something hidden beneath. Tom's heart raced. He picked up the hammer and began removing the flooring. With each blow, dust scattered into the air, and the echo seemed to grow louder. After a few minutes, the hammer struck something metal. He brushed it away with his hand, revealing a rusty, square lid with a handle in the middle. It was a hatch. He stood there staring at it, smelling the cold air escaping from the crack, heavy with an old, musty smell. And in that instant, a doubt began to grow within him. If there was a hatch there, what else was hidden beneath? The sound returned. A murmur, faint, almost a whimper. Only this time, it didn't come from the wall. It came from beneath his feet. And for the first time, Tom felt something that wasn't just fear. It was the knowledge that whatever was buried there didn't just want to be found. It wanted out. Howard Lindsley. That name began to dominate Tom's thoughts. He repeated it in his mind, like a mantra, as if trying to understand that man were the key to deciphering what was happening inside that building. In the following days, he dove headfirst into everything he could find about the former owner. He combed through old newspapers, city archives, civil records. He discovered that Howard had been a brilliant engineer specializing in underground structures, hired by the government in the 1980s to develop nuclear fallout shelters. But after a nervous breakdown, he abandoned everything, sold the house where he lived, and disappeared from view. The last official mention of him was in 1998, the same year the disappearances in Cedar Hollow began. Gradually, an image began to form in Tom's mind. Howard was described as a solitary, methodical man with paranoid tendencies. Some neighbors said he believed the world was about to end, and that only those he chose would survive. Others claimed he heard voices and spent entire nights digging underground in his own yard, muttering to himself. Tom imagined that man, thin, with sunken eyes, breathing within cold concrete walls, building corridors and secret doors. But the most disturbing detail was the motif Howard repeated in every entry found in his diaries. I protect them. Out there, the world is over. Those words rang in Tom's head. Protected who? From what? And why had no one ever found these protected people? The more he read, the more he believed the building where he worked wasn't just an abandoned building, but Howard's latest project. A shelter, perhaps, or something worse. A place where he kept people believing the outside world was uninhabitable, controlling them with fear, isolation, and lies. Tom began to imagine those voices he'd heard. They weren't ghosts, as some said. They could be people, alive, enclosed. For years, believing everything outside was destroyed. Howard's notes were disturbing. He was talking about purification, about recreating humanity away from corruption. But most disturbing was a hand-scrawled, nearly illegible passage Tom found in a scanned document. Children cry, but they soon become accustomed to silence. Fear is what maintains obedience. Reading it, Tom felt a chill run down his spine. Children cry. The words echoed in his mind, mingling with the sound he'd heard behind the wall. It was the same kind of cry, short, weak, resigned. He returned to the building with a new obsession. Now he no longer sought to understand the sound. He wanted to understand Howard. He began walking the corridors, noting measurements, trying to identify changes in the structure that might indicate hidden passages. In certain spots, the concrete was denser. In others, the sound rang hollow. He even discovered that some columns had unnecessary metal reinforcements, as if hiding something within them. He knew he was close, and the closer he got, the more the building seemed to react. The air grew colder, the silence deeper. One of those nights, while studying the building's records, Tom came across an old blueprint, a version that had never been officially filed. The plan marked a basement area, unconnected to the rest of the structure. A room with no doors, no stairs, no windows, just a single block of concrete directly beneath the wall from which the sounds were coming. In the corner of the paper, a notation in irregular handwriting. Sector H, isolated for maximum security. The H could stand for Howard, or something much worse. Tom felt his stomach churn. Everything made sense now. The building had been built to hide this section, a sealed, inaccessible underground space where something or someone had been placed. And the sound he heard was the echo that managed to escape through tiny cracks, perhaps through the old pipes, through the plumbing, through gaps, between the blocks. This explained why the sound seemed to change direction, why it sometimes came from the floor, sometimes from the wall. The building was an acoustic trap designed to confuse, but there was one detail that haunted him. On the plan, in the lower right corner, there was a signature, Howard Lindsley, 1998, and right below it, a second signature, one that made no sense at all. Emily Sanders, the name of Linda's missing sister-in-law. Tom stared at the paper for long minutes, unable to comprehend. How could Emily's name be there, dated the same year she disappeared? Was it a coincidence? Was it a forgery? Or had she been there in that building with Howard before she vanished? His heart was pounding. Now it wasn't just about a sound or an investigation. It was about someone in the family, and the weight of it hit him hard. He remembered Linda, how she avoided talking about her sister, how her silence always seemed to hide something. And for the first time, Tom wondered if the pain she carried hadn't originated there. He knew what he had to do. The hatch he'd found days earlier was the only way to reach Sector H. He needed to discover what lay down there, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. The job would require strength, equipment, and someone he could trust. That's when he thought of calling his old friend from his firefighting days, Jack Lawson, a discreet but loyal man, someone who wouldn't call him crazy without seeing it for himself. He picked up the phone, hesitated for a moment, and then called. When Jack answered, Tom's voice sounded different, heavier, more urgent. "Jack, I need you to come to Cedar Hollow. It's about the building. I think there are people alive down there." On the other end of the line, silence stretched. Then Jack responded in a low, almost incredulous tone. "Tom, are you sure about what you're saying?" Tom took a deep breath, looked at the blueprint in his hands, at Howard's name and Emily's side by side, and replied firmly, "I'm not, but I need to find out." As he hung up, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the sensation of being on the verge of a point of no return. Because if he was right, if there really was someone there, then Howard Lindsley's hell had never been closed. He just remained hidden, waiting for someone to have the courage to open the door again. The phone was still shaking in Tom's hand when he hung up. The call with Jack had put him on a high he hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if his entire body was primed for a mission, the same kind of adrenaline that had filled him in his old firefighting days before everything went wrong. But this time, the fire was different. It came from within. It burned in his conscience, in his guilt, in his fear, and most of all in the need to find out what the hell was buried in that building. The next morning, he told Linda that Jack was coming to help him with some technical work on the construction site. He avoided details and lied about the reason. He said they needed to reinforce the structure, that they had found dangerous cracks in the basement. She eyed him suspiciously, sensing something behind his restrained tone, but decided not to press the issue. Tom seemed too tired for another argument. The look in his eyes, however, said it all, the kind of look someone gets when they're about to do something that could change everything. Jack arrived that afternoon, driving an old pickup truck and carrying a backpack full of equipment, flashlights, ropes, tools, a gas detector, and a first aid kit. Their reunion was silent, marked by a firm handshake and a heavy look, like someone sharing a memory they'd rather forget. "It's been a while since I've seen you like this, Tom. You've got that look in your eyes, the same look as before." Tom pretended not to understand. He didn't want to talk about the past. They entered the building shortly after 6, just as the sun was beginning to disappear behind the trees. The air was colder than usual, and the echo of their footsteps resounded as if the entire building could hear them. Tom pointed to the hatch. Jack knelt, examined it with the flashlight, and ran his hand along the metal edge. This isn't ordinary, it was built to last. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. Tom nodded. Howard Lindsley, he replied quietly, almost as if pronouncing a forbidden name. With effort, they removed some of the concrete covering the lid and managed to force the lever until the hatch opened with a sharp click. A cold, heavy, damp air suddenly billowed, mixed with a sour smell of rust and mildew. Jack grimaced. "Something's dead down there," he muttered. Tom turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the hole. A rusty iron ladder descended into the darkness. "Looks like a maintenance access," Jack said, but his voice wasn't convinced. They descended slowly, the steps creaking under their weight. With each step, the sound of their boots echoed, unevenly, as if the walls were narrower than they actually were. The smell worsened as they descended, and the feeling of confinement intensified. When they reached the bottom, the beam of their flashlights revealed a narrow corridor lined with raw concrete. The wall was covered in marks, scratches, confusing symbols. Jack ran his fingers over them and said, "This was done with fingernails." The hallway stretched for about 10 meters until it reached a metal door. It was old, but solid, with a small circular window covered by an iron grate. Tom approached and shone the light inside. On the other side there was only darkness. He touched the handle and realized it was locked. He tried to force it, but it wouldn't budge. Then he knocked 3 times with his fist, the same pattern as always. 3 short knocks, a pause, 2 quick ones. Jack looked at him, confused. "What are you doing?" Tom replied without taking his eyes off the door. "Listen." For a few seconds, silence fell over the place. Then, from within the darkness came the sound. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 short ones, the exact same pattern. Jack took a step back, his face pale. "My God, someone's there." Tom nodded, his heart racing. "I told you." Jack grabbed the iron bar and began to pry at the lock. With each blow, the metal groaned, the sound echoing like a scream through the tunnel. Tom held the flashlight with trembling hands, shining it on the padlock until, with a snap, it broke. They pushed open the door. The cold air that rushed out seemed to chill their bones. The flashlight cut through the darkness and revealed something they would never forget. A large, damp room with stained walls and old mattresses strewn across the floor. Water bottles, food scraps, children's toys, small clothes, and at the bottom, a mark made in red paint, almost faded by time, but still legible. "They are safe with me." The phrase, the same one from Howard's writings. Tom felt a knot in his stomach. Jack's flashlight trembled in his hand, and the sound of their breathing was the only audible sound. The silence was so thick it felt alive. Tom took a few steps forward, examining the floor. There were signs of recent dragging, as if someone had moved there recently. A faint noise made them both turn at the same time, a faint groan coming from a dark corner of the room. Jack shined the light. For a moment, nothing. Then, a slow movement. An arm, thin, dirty, trembling. Then a face, pale, eyes blinking. In the light, a woman. She was alive. Tom ran to her, knelt and tried to speak, but his voice faltered. Jack took off his coat and covered the woman, who seemed unable to understand what was happening. Her mouth opened, trying to form words, but only hoarse sounds came out, as if she hadn't spoken in years. Tom gently took her hand and asked, "How many more are in here?" The woman turned slowly, her eyes wide, and pointed with a trembling finger toward the end of the hallway. Tom followed the gesture with his flashlight. The light revealed something that knocked the breath from his lungs. A second door, just like the last, and behind it, a sound he knew well. The same muffled cry, the same cry for help. Jack looked at him, breathless. "Tom, this is too big. We need to call for help now." But Tom didn't answer. He just stared at the door, the sound growing clearer, closer. His gaze was fixed, determined, and for the first time, Jack realized his friend wasn't just trying to rescue someone. He was trying to redeem himself, because deep down Tom knew this place was more than a shelter. It was the tomb of an ancient promise, and he was about to open it. The air below was so heavy, It seemed to have a body. Each breath was a struggle, a mixture of rust, damp, and ancient despair. The woman they had found was shaking uncontrollably, her eyes fixed on the second door, as if expecting something to burst out at any moment. Tom and Jack glanced at each other, and that look was enough to tell them that what was to come would be worse. Tom stood slowly, his face covered in dust, his heart beating erratically. He knew what he was about to do could change everything, but he also knew that if he didn't, he would never be able to live with it. "There are more people there," Tom muttered, more to himself than to Jack. The echo of his own voice sounded distant, as if the building had swallowed the words. Jack hesitated. "Tom, we need to get out of here and call for backup. This woman needs a hospital. We don't know what's behind that door." But Tom was already walking toward her. The sound of his boots echoed on the concrete, each step vibrating the frigid air. When he stopped in front of the door, he noticed the metal was scratched. Dozens, maybe hundreds of marks, as if someone had tried to get out. He put his ear to it and listened. It wasn't just crying. It was voices. Many. Some whispered, some moaned, some seemed to pray in disconnected murmurs. It was impossible to count how many there were. The flashlight's beam trembled in his hand. He glanced at Jack, who was shaking his head nervously, gripping the iron lever tightly. "We can't open this alone, Tom. It could be too dangerous." Tom replied hoarsely, never taking his eyes off the door. "They've been in danger for too long." With a blow, Jack broke the padlock. The metallic clang echoed like subterranean thunder. A brief silence followed, the kind of silence that seems to precede something terrible. Then the lock gave way and the door creaked open. The darkness beyond seemed alive, dense, moving. The scent that escaped made Jack recoil. It was the smell of what remains when life is gone, but the body remains. Tom turned on the flashlight and took the first step. The beam of light cut through the darkness and revealed something neither of them was prepared to see. The room was large, but the low ceiling made it stifling. There were makeshift beds, torn mattresses, broken toys, and children's clothes scattered across the floor. On the walls were phrases written in charcoal and dried blood. "The world has ended. He said it was safe here. We can't leave." The sound of voices came from a dark corner, where a rusty grate separated the room. Tom approached, his heart racing, and shone the light inside. Behind the grate, 4 people, thin, dirty, wide-eyed, huddled like frightened animals. When the light hit them, one of them covered his face and began to cry. Another just kept repeating in a shaky voice, "He'll come back, he'll come back." Tom knelt down, trying to calm them. "It's okay, you're safe now. It's over." But one of the women, her face scarred and lips cracked, shook her head desperately. "It's not over," she whispered. "He's still here." That sentence froze the air. Jack looked around, searching for an exit, and then he heard it. Footsteps coming from the hallway. Slow, heavy, shuffling footsteps echoing between the concrete walls. Tom turned suddenly, his flashlight shaking. "Is anyone there?" he called, his voice cracking. No answer, just the sound getting closer. Jack grabbed the iron bar, gripping it with both hands. The sound stopped. For a moment, the silence seemed absolute, until something metallic fell to the hallway floor, echoing like a warning. Tom stepped forward, trying to see beyond the beam of light, but it was pitch black. The woman behind the gate began screaming hysterically, pounding on the bars. "Don't let him in! He can't come back!" Jack grabbed her shoulders, trying to calm her, but her screams echoed throughout the shelter. The footsteps began again, faster now, closer, and suddenly a sharp thud on the wall shook the floor. Tom swung the flashlight and saw something that made him flinch. A shadow crossing the hallway, tall, distorted, impossible to identify. He and Jack exchanged glances. They both knew they had to get out of there. Quickly, Jack helped open the grate, freeing the people one by one. They were weak, barely able to walk, but the urgency made their bodies react. Tom led them to the stairs, urging them on. "Come on, it's over, just a little longer." The hallway, however, seemed narrower than before, the air heavier, and the sound of footsteps continued. But now it seemed to come from all directions at once. Jack glanced back and saw something moving in the darkness. It wasn't clear what it was, a figure perhaps, but there were eyes. Eyes reflecting the flashlight beam for a second, before disappearing. They reached the base of the stairs, and Tom was helping the last survivor up when the noise suddenly stopped. The absolute silence returned, piercing, suffocating. Everyone stood still, breathing heavily. Jack turned slowly, shining one last light into the hallway. Nothing, just emptiness and the echo of hurried breaths. Tom was the last to climb in. Before closing the hatch, he took one last look at the darkness below. He had the feeling that, even though he couldn't see anything, someone was watching back, and deep down he knew the woman was right. This wasn't over, not even close. As the iron lid closed, muffling the sounds from underground, Tom felt a pang in his chest, a bitter mixture of relief and terror, because somewhere inside him, a doubt grew that he didn't want to admit. What if the man who was still there had never left? What if the true hell of this place wasn't what lay beneath the ground, but what still awaited them up here? The hatch closed, with a sharp click, and the metallic sound echoed through the building like a final warning. For a few seconds, no one moved. The group breathed heavily, covered in dust and fear. Tom leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath, his heart pounding in his temples. Jack, on the other side, still held the iron bar, as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the hole. The women wept silently, holding each other, their bodies trembling with shock and relief. The air inside the building felt different now, heavier, as if saturated with what they had just unleashed. "We have to get out of here now," Jack said firmly, his voice hoarse. "There's no telling how long this place can hold." Tom nodded, but didn't move immediately. He stared at the hatch, the metal covered in grime and old stains. He could still hear the echo of footsteps below, or maybe it was just his mind playing tricks. It consumed him. Something inside him told him this story wasn't over yet, that what they'd found was just a sliver, the surface of something much deeper. They hurried out of the building. The dawn glare blinded their tired eyes. The sun rising over Cedar Hollow seemed out of place, almost cruel in contrast to what they had left behind. In the courtyard, Tom helped the survivors sit on the ground. There were 5 of them now, 4 adults and a younger woman, the first they had encountered. All of them were thin, with lost looks, their skin too pale. One of the men mumbled incoherently, mentioning the name Howard repeatedly, as if it were a prayer or a curse. Jack called the fire department and the police, trying to explain in a few words what they had found. On the other end of the line, the silence lasted longer than it should have. As the sirens began to approach, Tom felt the weight of everything crashing down on him. Images came to him in quick flashes: the hallway, the frightened faces, the slogans on the walls, the unbearable smell. He would never get it out of his head again. Jack put a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Tom. They're alive because of you." Tom nodded, but his expression was blank. What troubled him wasn't what he'd found, but what he hadn't. Those survivors were only part of the mystery. The woman had said he was still there. So where was he? The authorities arrived quickly, but their expressions spoke volumes. Disbelief, shock, and then a rush to control the situation. Ambulances, patrol cars, FBI agents. Maple Street was cordoned off. As the survivors were taken away, Tom watched in silence. One of the officers, Sergeant Dugan, approached with a stern expression. "Harris, what the hell did you do here?" Tom stared at him, exhausted. "What you should have done years ago." The sergeant didn't answer. He simply glanced at the building and ordered a search team to be assembled. Hours later, the place was in chaos. Men with flashlights, drones, and scanning equipment moved everywhere. Tom and Jack stood outside watching as the agents descended through the hatch. Time passed slowly. When the first group returned to the surface, the face of one of the men said it all. He shook his head. "We found no one down there. Just empty corridors, no sign of people." Tom was silent, trying to understand. "What do you mean?" "They were there. I saw them. I touched them. There were people alive." But the agent simply replied coldly, "What you saw isn't there anymore." That sentence kept echoing in Tom's mind. "It's not there anymore." He turned to Jack, desperate. "They didn't disappear, Jack. They took them. Someone took them." Jack looked around tensely. "Who, Tom? Who would have that kind of control?" Before he could answer, one of the firefighters approached, his face pale, holding something in his hands, a dirty badge covered in dust. He handed it to Tom without a word. When he wiped it with his thumb, the name stamped on it made his stomach churn. Emily Sanders, Linda's sister-in-law. Tom felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, The world spun and he had to hold onto the wall to keep from falling. It was impossible. He'd hoped to find her alive, even after all these years, but he never imagined her name would be there, lost among the rubble. Jack tried to help him, but Tom pulled his hand away. He stared at the badge as if it were proof that something much bigger was happening. Howard Lindsley might be dead, but his legacy, the shelter, the fear, the control, still lived on. The news spread throughout the city within hours. The newspapers spoke of a shocking discovery, an underground shelter, and victims of the past. But Tom knew the story being told to the public was incomplete. The official version claimed the shelter had been used by an isolated group of vulnerable people who hid for years, believing a global catastrophe was brewing. There was no mention of Howard, nor of the fact that the building belonged to him. No explanation as to how these people had survived so long without being found. That night, back at home, Tom was silent. Linda watched him, trying to understand what he had seen. He held Emily's name tag in his hands, his eyes fixed on the name. "She was there," he whispered. "I know she was." Linda was crying but said nothing. There was something in his voice that frightened her. It wasn't pain. It was conviction. The conviction of someone who knew there was still a piece of the story no one wanted to tell. Outside, Cedar Hollow seemed peaceful again. But to Tom, the town's silence was just the sound of what came before a new discovery, because deep down he felt, no matter what anyone said, no matter what the police denied, that there was still someone down there, someone watching, waiting, and that perhaps the hatch had never truly closed. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the woman he'd met first, her empty gaze, her trembling voice saying, "He's still here." These words echoed in his head, mixed with the sound of the hatch closing, the metallic clang of the lock breaking, the muffled screams from underground. He tried to convince himself it was all over, that he'd finally done what should have been done years ago. But the truth was, nothing inside him felt resolved. His body was home, but his mind was still there, in the dark. Around 3 in the morning, a sound woke him, a soft noise like a cracking sound coming from the window. He got up slowly, looked outside and saw only the deserted street, shrouded in a thin mist. The silence seemed normal, but there was something strange, a feeling that he wasn't alone. He returned to the living room, turned on the light, and there, on the table, he saw his badge, Emily Sanders, the same one he'd found hours earlier. Only now the badge was wet, dripping. He picked it up carefully and smelled the dampness. That badge hadn't been like this when he'd brought it. And the question came, cold and sharp. How could something have gotten wet if there was no water anywhere? Linda appeared at the door, sleepy, asking what was going on. Tom simply replied, "I think someone was here." She frowned, confused. "In here?" He didn't answer. She walked to the front door and noticed something. The key was still in it, but the handle was marked. Someone had tried to open it. A shiver ran down her spine. She went back inside and locked the door again, trying to convince herself it was just fatigue playing, tricks on her mind. But deep down she knew it wasn't. At dawn, Jack called. His voice sounded different, strained. "Tom, I need to tell you something. The reports we submitted yesterday are gone." Tom froze. "What do you mean they're gone?" Jack explained that he had gone to the police station to get a copy of the building's registration and file, but they said there was nothing in Howard Lindsley's name or the Maple Street address. The raid report had also disappeared from the system. "It's like nothing happened," Jack said, "and no one in there wants to talk about it. They just look at me like I'm making it all up." Tom felt his blood boil. The same old anger returned, that suffocating feeling of seeing the truth buried. "They're trying to erase everything," he said through gritted teeth, "but they won't succeed." He took Emily's badge, put it in his pocket, and left the house without saying where he was going. He drove to the building, now surrounded by yellow tape and patrol cars. Police officers guarded the entrance, and one of them stopped him from approaching. "Area cordoned off, sir. Department orders." Tom tried to argue, but the officer's cold gaze told him it was futile. However, something caught his attention, the sound of an engine turning off behind him. When he turned, he saw a black car parked across the street. 2 men in dark suits got out. They weren't from the local police. One of them, tall and grey-haired, walked toward the police station and flashed a badge Tom couldn't read. The officer let him pass without question. The other man looked in Tom's direction for a few long seconds, then followed his colleague and entered the building. Tom's stomach churned. This wasn't a simple investigation. Someone was controlling what could and couldn't be revealed. Later, he met Jack at a secluded cafe outside the city. They were both tense, speaking softly, constantly glancing over their shoulders. Jack told him he'd received an anonymous call the night before. The voice on the other end was calm, measured. A man. He simply said, "Some doors should stay closed." Then the line ended. Tom stared at him, unblinking. "They know who we are. They're trying to silence us." Jack hesitated. "Tom, we've messed with something big. This isn't just about a madman and a shelter. There are powerful people involved." Tom leaned back in his chair, exhausted. The weight of Jack's words seemed to confirm what he already knew. Howard Lindsley might have built that shelter decades ago, but someone kept it running. Someone protected it. And now those same people were erasing everything. Emily's badge, the records, the reports. Everything disappearing, one by one. Worst of all, the more they tried to hide it, the more certain Tom became that he was right. Before they said goodbye, Jack grabbed his arm. "Promise me you won't go back there, Tom. We've done what we could. They'll destroy you if you keep going." Tom forced a smile, but didn't answer. He got back in the car, rested his head on the steering wheel and sat there for a while, listening to the wind against the windshield. Then he noticed something that made him look up. In the rear-view mirror, there was something on the back seat, a folded piece of paper. He took the paper with trembling hands. It was a copy of the building's blueprint, the same one he'd shown Jack, the one labeled Sector H. Only now, there was a new, handwritten note in red ink, Sector 1, below. Tom stared at it. Those words for a long time, his heart racing. Sector 1 below. This meant there was another deeper level beyond the one where they'd found the people. A lower level. A place no one, not him, not Jack, not the police, had ever seen. For a moment, the silence inside the car was total. Then, in the background, the cell phone vibrated. An unidentified message appeared on the screen. 3 words. Simple. Cold. "You're not done." Tom felt his body go cold. He looked around, his heart racing, his breath shallow. Outside, fog shrouded the road, and the world seemed suspended between the real and the impossible. He swallowed hard, looked at the paper again, and thought, if there was a Sector 1, then Howard's hell didn't end underground. It continued deeper, and maybe it was still open. Tom stood motionless in the car, the paper trembling between his fingers. The world around him seemed to have stopped, as if time had held its breath along with him. Those 3 words on the screen, "You're not done," didn't sound like a threat. They sounded like a reminder, a whisper coming from a place he already knew, that same subterranean echo that seemed to follow him since the day he heard the first cry. He looked back at the plant, at the words written in red. Sector 1 below. Below what? Below the hell they had already seen, below the people they had rescued, or below the truth everyone was trying to hide. The sound of a distant horn brought him back to reality. The cafe was already closed, the parking lot empty, and night was falling heavily over Cedar Hollow. Tom tucked the paper carefully into his jacket, started the car, and stood for a while just staring at the reflection of the lights on the windshield. He could simply go home, pretend none of this existed, let the authorities handle the case, but he knew what that meant in practice. Silence, manipulation, oblivion. The people below would be treated like madmen, the building would be demolished, and the mystery buried once more. No, he couldn't let that happen. He drove back to Maple Street, but parked 2 blocks away so as not to attract attention. The building was completely cordoned off. Tape, police cars, spotlights, 2 guards at the entrance. The kind of security you use not to protect an abandoned place but to hide what's inside. Tom watched for a few minutes, mapping the activity. At 11:20 p.m., the guards were relieved. He waited for one of them to go inside for a smoke, and the other to walk away to his car. It was now or never. He crossed the street quickly and entered through the back, through an unlocked side window, the same one he had entered through days before. The cold, damp air enveloped him like an old enemy. Everything inside the building looked the same, but something was different. A sense of presence. The sound of falling drops echoed in the darkness, the smell of dust mixed with something metallic, rust, perhaps old blood. He turned on the flashlight, the beam, cutting through the darkness and revealing marks on the floor. Footprints. Recent. His heart raced. He wasn't alone. He followed the footprints to the hallway that led to the hatch. Broken concrete still marked the spot where they'd dug, but now the lid was open. A metal ladder led down into the darkness. He knelt and looked down. Dim, yellowish lights flickered at regular intervals. Someone was down there. Someone had reopened the shelter. Tom took a deep breath and began descending. Each step creaked, the sound mixing with the pounding of his heart. The air was colder, almost sharp. When he reached the ground, he saw that the corridor was not as it had been before. The walls had been cleaned, the markings erased, the beds removed. The shelter was reorganized. And beyond there was a new passage, a hole in the ground reinforced with iron bars, descending even deeper. On the concrete, an old crooked sign, Sector 1. Tom's stomach churned. This wasn't in the original blueprint. It was new or too hidden to have been detected. He descended the makeshift staircase, and the beam of his flashlight revealed a narrow, metal-lined hallway. The walls were covered in rust stains, and from time to time he saw electrical cables dangling from the ceiling, connected to noisy generators. The sound of forced ventilation echoed throughout, and the smell of burning ozone stung his eyes. It was like being inside a forgotten laboratory. At the end of the corridor, a steel door, small, reinforced, with a rectangular opening in the center, like those used in isolation cells. Tom approached slowly, his heart racing. From the opening came a flickering light, and with it, the sound. Not crying, but measured, rhythmic, almost calm breathing. He pressed his ear against it, trying to hear better. That's when a voice rang out from the other side, low, hoarse, but clear enough to chill the blood. "I knew you would come back." Tom took a step back, his entire body trembling. That voice. It was human, real, alive, and most frighteningly, it knew his name. He tried to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. The voice continued, now more firmly. "I tried to warn you, but you opened the wrong door." The sound of breathing intensified, as if the person on the other side had moved closer. Tom shone his light into the crack, but all he saw were two eyes reflecting the light, clear, almost grey, cold as wet glass. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice breaking. The answer came slowly, drawn out, like a whisper mixed with a smile. "I'm what's left of what you saved." Tom recoiled, panic rising. The voice seemed to know not only his name, but also everything he had done. Before he could react, a metallic clang echoed, the sound of locks being unlocked one by one from inside. He instinctively took 2 steps back, the flashlight trembling in his hands. The door creaked. It opened just enough for cold air and the smell of rust to fill the hallway. From the darkness, something moved. Not quickly, but with the calm of someone who knows they don't need to run. Tom felt his instinct scream inside him, "Run!" But he froze. The eyes before him glowed, human and yet wrong. Then the voice spoke again, this time soft, almost gentle. Howard was never the only one. Tom took another step back, the flashlight flickering, his heart pounding, and before he could comprehend what those words meant, the light flickered, the generator screeched, and everything was plunged into darkness. Darkness swallowed everything. A heavy silence filled the corridor, so dense it felt weightless. Tom felt his heart race, his breath trapped in his chest, his muscles tense. The flashlight blinked once, twice, and then went out completely. He was blinded, immersed in absolute darkness, where the only audible sound was his own breathing, and the other. Yes, there was another breathing there, slow, close, rhythmic, a presence watching him, knowing exactly where he was, and seeming to feed on the fear spreading within him like poison. Instinctively he took a step back, trying to find the stairs, but the ground beneath his feet was uneven, as if the hallway had warped. His mind screamed to run, but his body wouldn't respond. Then a voice whispered in the darkness, very close to his ear, so close he felt the warm air of the words. "You came to see what you shouldn't have." Tom turned sharply, his heart pounding in his throat. He shouted, "Who are you?" No answer, just a faint sound, like something scraping on the floor. He fumbled in his pocket until he found the lighter he always carried, an old habit from his firefighter days. He lit it. The flame flickered, illuminating only a small circle around it. The air was thick with particles, dust, maybe ash. At the end of the hallway, something was moving. It was a human silhouette, but contorted, as if the body had forgotten how to stand upright. It walked slowly, its bare feet scraping against the metal, its long, tousled hair covering part of its face. Tom raised his lighter and stepped forward, trying to get a better look. The figure stopped. Then he raised his head, and that was when he saw it. The face was pale, covered in old scars, but what froze him most were the eyes. He knew those eyes, grey, vivid, frighteningly familiar. For a second his brain refused to accept what it saw. "No, it can't be," he murmured. But the voice that came, low and hoarse, confirmed the impossible. "Tom, Era Emily, Sanders Linda's missing sister-in-law, the woman he believed had died years ago." Tom approached slowly, the lighter trembling in his hand. "Emily, my God, you're alive." She gave a half-smile, weak, almost sad. "Alive?" she repeated, her tone almost mocking. "No, he didn't leave anyone alive down here." Her eyes drifted as if staring at something behind her, into the darkness. "Howard promised the world out there would end, and when we found out he lied." Her voice trailed off, and she took a step forward, the light flickering over her face, revealing something even more terrifying. On her neck, a deep mark, like the trace of an old collar. Tom felt his stomach turn. "Emily, he's dead. It's over. You're free now." She shook her head slowly. "Howard didn't die, Tom. He just changed bodies." Her gaze fixed on him, steady, cold, intense. "You opened the shelter, brought everything back. He always needs someone to continue the work. And now, he has you." Tom recoiled, shaking his head, his breath quickening. "No, no, you don't know what you're saying." But before he could say anything else, the lighter went out. The darkness returned, and with it the sound of chains dragging, a metallic, uneven clang coming from all directions. He fumbled frantically in his pocket, trying to rekindle the fire, but his fingers were shaking too much. And then another voice, deeper, more distant, but unmistakable, echoed through the tunnel. "They are safe with me." The same phrase, "the one," written on the walls, engraved in the diaries, whispered by the victims, now spoken there, alive, real. Tom felt his heart stop for a second. The flame flared again, weakly, and what he saw made him recoil with a scream stuck in his throat. The hallway was full of people, men, women, children, all with the same empty eyes, pale skin, bodies covered in scars. They stood still, as if awaiting orders, and among them the figure of Emily, now smiling, her face half hidden in shadow. "We were waiting for you." Tom dropped the lighter. The flame went out as it touched the ground, and in the darkness he heard the chains move again. Only this time they were coming toward him. A sound of footsteps, slow, rhythmic, steady. Each beat echoed off the metal like the ticking of a clock nearing its end. He turned to run, but the ground seemed to give way beneath his feet. The sound of iron and concrete mingled with the echo of voices, dozens of them, all repeating the same chorus. "You opened. You opened. You opened." The lantern on the floor flickered one last time, and for a brief instant, before everything was plunged back into total darkness, Tom saw it. A reflection in the metal before him, a face, his own, but with Howard Lindsley's eyes. The sound that followed was a closing sound, heavy, final, and then silence. A silence so absolute it seemed to swallow the whole world. The Cedar Hollow sun rose grey that day, and the town seemed eerily quiet, as if the world knew, without understanding how, that something terrible had ended, or begun again. The Maple Street building was surrounded by tape, official vehicles, and curious onlookers trying to understand the inexplicable. Journalists spoke of a new tragedy, a shocking discovery, a mysterious operation, but no one had any answers. The only certainty was that morning, the underground generators had shut down by themselves, and the whole place seemed to have changed. Jack was the first to arrive. They found Tom's car parked a few feet from the construction site, with the driver's door ajar and the headlights on. On the passenger seat were a lighter, the broken tail light, and a dirt-stained plant. The same one that showed the sector eye, but Tom was nowhere to be found. He had vanished without a trace, as if he had dissolved into thin air. The hatch, which had previously been locked, was now open. When the agents descended, they found the corridor completely empty. None of the people who had been rescued, no bodies, nothing. Only the echo of the wind and the marks of chains scattered across the floor. Jack descended with the team, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Everything looked the same, and yet different. The walls were clean, the old marks erased, and where dried blood and rust had once been, there was now something new, an inscription, carved precisely into the damp, still fresh concrete. "They are safe with me." The same phrase, the same invisible signature. Jack recoiled, his heart racing, his mind trying to deny the obvious. Back above ground, the agents said they would seal the building again, demolish the entire structure. Jack stood, staring at the broken window on the second floor, the one Tom had entered through so many times. For a moment he swore he saw a shadow move inside, like someone watching. When he blinked, there was nothing, just the wind. But he felt it. He felt the presence. That night, Linda was visited by two men in suits. They told her that Tom had disappeared during the investigation and that the case was being treated with the utmost confidentiality. They handed her a sealed folder and asked her not to speak to anyone about what had happened. Before leaving, one of them left a card on her desk with no name on it, just a number and the symbol of an inverted triangle. When she opened the folder, she found a single sheet of paper. At the top, typed, Sector 1, Experiment Closed, and just below, an old newspaper. Clipping with a black and white photo of Howard Lindsley, smiling. Linda ran her fingers over the image, her heart racing. Howard's face looked younger, but there was something in his eyes, something uncomfortably familiar. That same expression Tom had been wearing these past few days, a cold, distant look, but with a kind of calm within the madness. She let the paper fall to the floor, her hands shaking. In that instant, she realized the house was completely silent. And then he heard 3 beats, a pause, 2 short ones. They came from the basement. Linda's blood ran cold. She stood still, her entire body trembling, her heart racing as if it wanted to run away on its own. Her breath became shallow, her eyes fixed on the stairs leading down. The knocking repeated, louder now. "Tom," she whispered, but her voice was weak, almost soundless. No answer, just the echo of the knocking, steady, rhythmic. She took a step forward, then another. The wood floor creaked beneath her feet. The air felt colder, heavier with that same rusty, musty smell Tom had described weeks before. When she reached the top of the stairs, she looked down into the darkness and saw something move below. A shadow, a reflection, perhaps just a trick of the light. But for a second, what she saw seemed too real to be imagined. A pair of eyes, glowing in the darkness. Eyes she would recognize anywhere. Tom's eyes. A sharp chill ran down her spine. The knocking stopped. A deep silence fell over the house. And, for a brief moment, Linda thought she heard one last phrase, almost a whisper coming from below, like the echo of an ancient promise. "They are safe with me." The sound faded, but the silence that remained was different. It was the kind of silence that never ends, that just waits. And in that moment, Linda understood what Tom had discovered too late. Some doors, once opened, never close again. Now you understand why some stories don't end, they just change shape. This video took you into a mystery where fear and curiosity walked side by side, where every detail felt like a warning, and somehow you were also part of this rescue. Stories like these move us, because they remind us that the truth may be hidden right beneath our feet. And that's why the next case will captivate you even more, a disappearance that should never have been forgotten, and a discovery that changes everything we think we know about the past. So, now that this story has made you feel the weight of silence and the strength of truth, show that you are also part of this. Let the like so that more people know what happened in Cedar Hollow and help this community grow with those who truly feel each twist and turn. Write your words in the comments below. True. So I know you've made it to the end, because those who seek the truth continue, and continue in the next video, which is already on the screen, ready to take you even deeper.